Well, thanks for coming to listen to me. You're going to suffer to an extent for the fact that I've spent 30 years thinking about this book and 3 years and a half sort of researching it and then writing it. So I've sort of got a lot to get off my chest. And where I wanted to start, which is probably not where Isabel would have liked me to start, is not much to do with whiskey really, but just to do with people. Because one of the things I've realized researching and writing this book is just how astonishing some of the people involved in the Johnnie Walker business were. And I'm going to read you a section here, which is about Alexander Walker, who was the son of John. Alexander was the man who inherited a grocery shop with a sort of wholesale business in blended whiskey and other wines and spirits in 1857. And by the time he died in 1889, left his sons and daughters an international whiskey business, possibly the largest in Scotland at the time. So this was a prodigious success, right? And Alexander was this incredible character who came to life for me over a period of about 9 months, reading through letters, handwritten letters from him, written by Clark, but dictated by him, to both his business contacts and also his intimate friends. You got a very interesting picture, and he's a really gruff, thrawn is the word I use, is a real Kilmarnock word, thrawn, a gruff, thrawn, angry man, always worried about money, full of anxieties, and doesn't suffer fools gladly. And yet on the other hand, he's deeply compassionate. He loves his friends, he loves his family, and he loves having fun with them. And I, as happens when you write books, actually, I have to say I sort of fell in love with Alexander. I mean, he's just such a character. And I wanted to read you a little bit about Alexander's sort of private life, but as you'll see, that private life is also business life in the 19th century whiskey industry. Alexander had acquired Marine Cottage in Troon in the late 1870s. Troon is 20 miles, 15 miles from Kilmarnock, on the coast, resort. In 1883, he viewed a substantial piece of ground in the same town from the Duke of Portland's estate and began the construction of Crosby Tower, a large mansion with substantial grounds, to the design of Gabriel Andrew. Gabriel Andrew was a young architect who designed and sort of project managed all the Walker buildings in Kilmarnock, which are still there, many of them, and quite remarkable buildings. He also sought to develop the adjacent site. He wrote, "I was a little afraid that some speculator would put down some garrison next to Crosby Tower, which I did not at all care for." Gardening was a passion for Walker. He was very proud to be honorary president of the Kilmarnock Horticultural Society, and he exhibited at local shows. In 1881, quote, "his collection of stove and greenhouse plants and model flower garden with rockery were the focus of attention." At Troon, he took great personal interest in the construction of an orchard house at Crosby Tower, where I can show my friends, he said, all my best plants. Both houses were also built with sufficient stable space to allow Alexander to indulge in his interest in keeping and breeding cobs, they're small ponies, okay, both for show and for driving. His success at the former was not always fully acknowledged, as he complained after one particularly successful year. "The proprietor of the Kilmarnock Standard here is a very strong radical, and because I take an interest in the other paper," in fact, along with two of his mates, he owned the Conservative newspaper in Kilmarnock, "because I take an interest in the other paper, he did not even mention me. He has heard plenty about it since." It was also Alexander's pleasure not just to take his small coach down to his offices in the town from Pearsland House, that was his house in Kilmarnock, where I actually stayed for about 4 weeks, because part of it was made into an Airbnb, and I thought it'd be a nice way to sort of really get into Alexander's head, or to get Alexander into my head, was to go and stay in his house. So not only to take his small coach down to his offices in the town from Piersland House, but also like a free spirit to take to the open road with his wife. In a day or two, we are off for a 10-day drive, he wrote to a friend, with the two cobs, just our two selves, with the coachman and a lad. The house at Troon also allowed Alexander Walker to indulge in his passion for golf. It was literally built next door to the newly established Troon Golf Club, now, of course, Royal Troon, of which Alexander was a founder member, jealously guarding the interests of Troon and Kilmarnock members against the much resented incursions of Glaswegians, who he criticised for trying to take over its management. It's a very entertaining exchange of letters between Alexander and W.A. Robertson of Robertson and Baxter, who represented the Glaswegian interest in the golf club. It's pretty severe, pretty severe correspondence. And actually, Robertson and Baxter were critical to Walker, so they had a very strong, positive business relationship. Crosby Tower and Piersland House in Kilmarnock were the focus for both domestic and business entertainment. For despite his occasional misanthropic outbursts, it's clear from his correspondence that alongside his family, Alexander Walker relished nothing more than good company and companionship and shared food and drink. Few visitors were discouraged, but sometimes, for all its critical importance in oiling the wheels of business, the duty of hospitality took a heavy toll. I am beginning to think that my health is of more importance to me than other people's enjoyment, he complained. We have had to do so much entertaining to colonials and cockneys that we hardly knew what it was to have a quiet day to ourselves. The consequence being that I am not all the man I should like to be, and I am determined I shall never attempt to do anything of the kind again. It seems so different entertaining strangers whom you may never see again compared with your real friends. John Blakey, who was his manager in London, was aware of the constant stream of visitors to Scotland and apologised that the irrepressible Robert McGilligan of R. Marquis McGilligan and Company, a frequent visitor to the London office in search of sherry and a biscuit, and also an important customer, it has to be said, had told Blakey that he intended to look you up because, as Blakey said, he is a chap not calculated to forward one's work. On the other hand, a visit from Bernard Lewis, who held the company's New Zealand agency, promised little distraction. I dare say, said Alexander, he will be a bit of a bore, but we must get through it as best we can. Family and friends were much preferred. We had a great party last night. About 50, I suppose. They seemed to enjoy themselves well, which was all that was wanted. It kept me a little from sleeping, but that was no matter. With the youngsters here, he wrote to a friend in January 1886, all around it has been parties every night. I expect we shall have the result of it by and by. At Christmas in particular, gifts of wine and whiskey were carefully dispatched to friends and customers. Game from the shoot he rented was sent to London to distribute as judiciously as possible. Kilmarnock cheese was a very special gift. Freshly shot game, pork pies, and even snails and frogs' legs. But it was something far more simple that stole his heart, as he wrote to a friend at Christmas in 1888, the year before he died. It occurred to me, he wrote, that you might still have a Scotch tooth in your head, and I have sent you a small box of Kilmarnock shortbread. I always tell my wife it is one of the shortest roads to heaven that I know of. So that's a little bit of Alexander Walker. As I say, a quite remarkable and captivating person. And I do have to say, he reminded me, he did remind me in a couple of ways of a few people that I've worked with, been lucky enough to work with in the whiskey industry as well. Big personalities. So now I thought I'd just move on and read a bit about the development of the Walker brands, which is probably a bit more interesting, although I think all the things I'm going to talk about now, or at least in the next few minutes, are from a whiskey auction or collector's point of view, what you might call unicorns, but we'll see. The proliferation of registered brands of blended scotches on the home market, along with the surge of brewers' bulk whiskies offered for sale in public houses, and the range of prices between these tap whiskies and the very best proprietary offerings. And just in case you're not clear, by proprietary offerings, it's like brands, you know, like Johnny Walker and Dewar's, whatever. Of the very best proprietary offerings, made it difficult for Walkers to maintain their trade with only one brand, their Old Highland or Kilmarnock whiskey, which had been introduced, as far as we know, in the mid 1860s, possibly a little earlier. We have trademark information and copyright information which dates it very much to then. As early as 1876, if not before, they were also selling a special whiskey, Very Old Highland, at a price premium to the main brand. Alexander Walker had also worked hard to develop a new brand, Glencairn, which was positioned away from Old Highland, both in terms of price, it was cheaper, and in character, which he said was distinct, a character all of its own. It was being sold in Australia by 1879 and was also sold in London, occasionally as the Royal Glencairn brand. No matter what its qualities, it was not destined for success. In case any of you are wondering about Glencairn and Glencairn glasses, this Glencairn was an area of Kilmarnock. That's where the name came from. It's part of the town. All three of these brands were being sold in both bulk and bottles and gallon jars. Walkers used both square and round bottles for Old Highland initially. Business correspondence suggests that the square bottle was championed more by the London office, despite Alexander Walker's concerns with managing what was the returnable square bottle. Alexander wrote, if we had simply carried out the principle of a round bottle in a common case, we would simply have sold a case of whiskey and had nothing more to do with it, instead of having all the trouble of returned empty, half-broken cases, broken bottles, and perhaps only half the number in each. The square bottles were returned for reuse by Walkers, whereas rounds, it was argued, were more attractive to customers and not returned. You will find that wine merchants will try and buy whiskey in bottles they can conveniently use for other purposes. Father, wrote Alexander's son George from London, is altogether averse to this style of package, and in the meantime won't entertain the idea at all. But the square bottle, although not the only one used in the world of Scotch whisky by 1880, in fact, Walker's neighbours, Rankins in Kilmarnock, also used a square bottle, and they eventually were acquired by Walkers, became part of the Walker business. But the square bottle clearly gave the brand name more distinctiveness, particularly when combined with the slanted label, and aided its visibility in an increasingly crowded category in both home and export markets. During the last decade of the 19th century, a third blend was added to the family of bottled whiskies, and they were renamed for sales purposes Old Highland, Special Old Highland, and Extra Special Old Highland. Quite a mouthful, really. Priced in London at 3 shillings and sixpence, 4 shillings and 4 shillings and sixpence. And these were being sold both in the UK and in Australia by the 1890s. So the principle of a range of 3 whiskies was established, and those 3 were the 3 that were to become, under quite different business circumstances actually, white, red, and black label in 1906. When of course they were, if I remember correctly, 8, 10, and 12 years old. And that introduction of an age segmented range of whiskies by Walkers in in 1908 was actually a masterstroke that was to serve the brand very well over the next years. And if you're wondering about white label, because occasionally bottles do turn up at auctions, it was withdrawn in 1917. So it was withdrawn during the First World War, when I think it was the second Alexander Walker, Alex Walker, pointed out to the board of directors that they were actually losing money on selling it. So eventually that one went, and they retained just red and black label. Is this okay so far, Isabel?
Keep going. Just had to unmute myself.
Okay. Right. Okay. So that's just background on how they ended up with three whiskies and how they evolved in the 19th century. And I thought I'd move on a bit though to what the brand actually was, because I've read out these names of the whiskies, Old Highland and Very Special and all this sort of stuff. But there's an interesting story about the brand as it develops in the 19th and 20th century, which was news to me when I researched and wrote the book. It was something I hadn't thought of, so it's very enlightening. And I'll just read to you a little bit about that. And we're now in the 1880s, 1890s, just in terms of the chronology. Despite the fact that they sat comfortably alongside, if not beyond, their main competitors by any relevant measure, Walkers had done relatively little to develop their brand in the minds of consumers. Indeed, for such a gigantic concern, as a surprised visitor to Kilmarnock from distant Glasgow described it in 1896, for such a gigantic concern, the company maintained a public reticence that was strikingly at odds with, for example, that stylish doyen of the turf, James Buchanan, or of course, John and in particular, Tommy Dewar. With titles, castles, country estates, art collections, and extensive racing stables, the so-called whiskey barons knew how to spend the spectacular profits they'd made during the 1890s. But for the Thrawn Walkers, arguably the most profitable of all these companies, such conspicuous consumption was anathema. This aversion to publicity and vulgar displays applied to the brand as well as the brand owners. In what was at the time a rare public appearance, the young Alex Walker, who it has to be said was one of the most scariest looking young men in the world, and he became a very scary old man, so he inherited that from his father. In a rare public appearance, the young Alex Walker articulated the company's philosophy in a scathing indictment of the Pattison crash of 1899, which was, he said, all due to lavish expenditure on advertising. To old-fashioned houses of the trade, he said, who had done business for nearly a century on the latter lines, the advent of the houses of mushroom growth, lavishly throwing money broadcast in advertisement, was viewed with great alarm. What a relief, therefore, it was when the bubble burst and the new-fashioned tactics were discredited. It was to be hoped the British public, who had been gulled long enough, would awaken to the fact that a largely over-advertised article could not be a good one. An obsession with quality, and the Walkers were, I mean, I know everyone talks these days, well, I'm obsessed with this, I'm obsessed with that. The Walkers were obsessed with quality. It's almost on every other page of Alexander Walker's letterbooks. They were obsessed with quality, and they were also obsessed with building up a huge inventory of whiskey, because the way you guaranteed quality was to have the best whiskey stocks. That was the game they played. An obsession with quality, and with what some no doubt regarded as an antiquated concern for honourable business methods, were the very lifeblood of the Walker business. But this overriding belief that quality would speak for itself louder than any promotion meant that whereas their rivals had been quick to adopt the new advertising techniques and opportunities of the 1890s, Walker's had steadfastly refused to, depending instead on old-fashioned salesmanship based on the product. The need to be seen and heard in the noisy debates of the What is Whiskey affair in the early 20th century meant that this was no longer a sustainable position. There was a further complication. With an unclear identity and having chosen not to invest in what we would term today as brand building, the company had created a vacuum which was filled by their consumers. For in their minds, in the minds of consumers and in popular culture, the Johnnie Walker brand, and I have to point out that's Johnnny, Johnny, the Johnnie Walker brand, and the idea of Johnnie Walker as a living personality had existed since the 1880s, if not long before. The firm may have declared itself to the world as John Walker and Sons in show cards and pub mirrors, and called its products Kilmarnock Whisky, which was embossed, by the way, on the punt of all their early square bottles, the punt being the bottom of the bottle. But increasingly, the brand, the whisky, was known in the minds of the trade and the public simply as Johnnie Walker. In these more materialistic days, the man is ignorant indeed who does not know that Johnnie Walker, the real Kilmarnock brand, has reached every part of the civilized world. Such a popular name, of course, is the popular designation that the man in the street has given to a popular article. Retailers advertised Johnnie Walker whiskies. Newspapers suggested themes for Johnnie Walker whisky advertisements. Humorists featured Johnnie Walker in their stories, and cartoonists celebrated Johnnie Walker in print. The Johnnie Walker Walk was a song performed in London's music halls, the most popular entertainment of the day, by the famed singer and comedian Charles Dean. Whilst the up-to-date, quote, the up-to-date Scotch comedian with a number of catchy songs, called, of course, Johnnie Walker, was becoming increasingly popular on the London and provincial theatre circuit. In 1893, at the Christmas treat for South Stoneham Workhouse near Southampton, the inmates enjoyed a supper of meat pies and beer, but the hosts were refreshed by sundry bottles of Johnnie Walker in the boardroom. Elsewhere, the demon Johnnie Walker was conjured up at temperance meetings. Members of the Peckham Grove Conservative Club demanded Johnnie Walker for the toast at their 1896 Christmas dinner. Johnnie Walker was known at almost every level of society, hard of hearing judges apparently being the exception. When a witness in the infamous Yarmouth murder trial of 1901 said that the defendant, a man called Herbert Bennett, who was accused of murdering his wife, said that Herbert Bennett had asked for a Johnnie Walker before he committed his crimes, quote, the Lord Chief Justice did not recognize this term from the dictionary of Bacchus and questioningly asked, gin and water? At which there was laughter, and the witness explained the precise meaning of Johnnie Walker, gin and Walker, Johnnie Walker. As Walker's whisky grew in fame and reputation, so Johnnie Walker lived and breathed in popular culture and in the popular imagination, a powerful brand asset waiting to be unlocked. And yet the company refused to take advantage. James Stevenson, a Kilmarnock man, actually Stevenson was the son of a man called Archibald Stevenson, who'd run the Walker's shop in Kilmarnock. He joined the company as a young boy. He went on into management, ran the Walker business in the Midlands of England, and then came down to London, in effect, as marketing director in about 1907 or 1908. A truly remarkable man. Truly remarkable man. James Stevenson explained, "We were not the originators of the word Johnny Walker. The public christened the brand, and for many years some of the directors strongly objected to it as being undignified." That goes back to that old way of doing business, right? Stevenson clearly did not share his fellow directors' reticence about using a popularization of the name of the firm's founder in connection with its whiskey. Neither George nor Alex Walker, which is Alexander's sons, would have met their grandfather, but it's very likely that even during their father's lifetime, Johnny Walker was being used as a popular shorthand for the brand. As we have already seen, Alexander Walker was a man of very firm opinion, who would not have failed to let his sons know his views on the subject. In matters of business, he very strictly referred throughout his correspondence to his firm as John Walker and Sons and his brand as Old Highland, or JWS and OH, with no variations or vulgarizations. Moreover, George and Alex had sisters and brothers with shares in the business, all of whom would have had opinions on the subject. Their grandmother Elizabeth, who outlived John, the founder, by over 30 years and remained in the old family home in India Street in Kilmarnock till her death in 1890, was also no doubt a formidable figure with a formidable point of view. And we know she exerted a very strong influence over Alexander, her son, until his death. But Stevenson persisted. And I'll stop reading there and just say that the rest of the story is simply a remarkable partnership between James Stevenson, an American advertising agent called Paul E. Derrick, who then brought in the creative talent of cartoonist Tom Brown, and in 1908 created the Johnny Walker we know in advertising and in branding, and overnight changed the semiotics of whiskey advertising, if not most advertising as well. It was absolutely a genius piece of work, and created the brand that's gone on to live for this bicentennial period, and I have no doubt for many hundreds of years beyond.
Thank you, Nick. That's wonderful. I hope everyone here has been taking notes. I have. And there will be a quiz at the end. Okay. I'm
sorry. I am sorry if I rattled on too long, but it's all in my head.
That was absolutely wonderful. So I, as always, put your questions on the messages. I'll come to those towards the end. I've got a few questions of my own, so I'll get through all of them. Just put them on there. There's lots of friends out here. There's Serge Valentin says hello. Laura Chilton says hello. There's
oh, Laura Chilton. So sorry. While I'm sitting up here pretending to be the great genius who did all the work, I should, in this public forum, acknowledge the fact that Laura Chilton spent many hours online and in the British Library doing newspaper research for me and made an invaluable contribution to the book. So thank you, Laura, very much.
Excellent. And Arturo Savage says hello. We've got James from my team. And I think I've mentioned everyone else so far. So as I say, pop your questions on the chat, and in the meantime, I've got some questions. Okay, so let's start with, you're publishing this for the 200th anniversary of Johnny Walker.
Yep.
There's some anniversary releases coming out. Is that today? They've been launched today?
No, there was a tasting. I've come hot foot from digitally I've come hot foot from a virtual tasting of these three new products. The first one, it's the only one I actually have here, which is a real beauty. It's called the Celebratory Blend. And this is also got a really lovely pack, actually. And the background there is King Street in Kilmarnock and Johnny Walker shop.
I hadn't seen that yet.
Yeah, so it's really nicely done. And in this, it's not a recreation of old Highland whiskey from the 1860s, which simply wouldn't be possible given the whiskies that were being used for it. But the one thing that the blenders did take as a sort of pointer was the fact that Walker whiskies, bottled Walker whiskies, were sold at either proof, which was 57 something percent, or what they called 10 under proof, which was 51% ABV. There was no regular standard strength for bottling whiskies. So this one is at 51%. So that's the sort of 10 under proof version. And then there's a blue label, and then there's a special bicentennial blend as well. And this one I can tell you is about 50 quid, and the other two are a bit more expensive. But this is a great price, and you can get this one in the UK on Amazon at the moment. You can order it now.
Superb. And then these presumably they're limited editions for just.
They are, and I've got no idea how limited means in this respect. They will be just for the year, you know.
Okay, good to know. Okay, so what was the best era for Johnny Walker? I mean, we've brought it right up to date. Started 200 years ago.
I think if you'd have asked any, well, maybe not John, who was really just a grocer who blended whiskey as well, but if you'd have asked Alexander and his sons, I'm sure Isabel, they would have always said the best era is the next era, because it was a really sorry,
but really,
no, it was a really forward-looking business, you know, and investment in distilling, in stocks. You know, when you're in the whiskey business, you're never thinking about the now. You're always thinking about the tomorrow. It's all about. That's the genius of it. So you have to put your heart in your hands and say people like Jim Beveridge, who are really responsible for the whiskies we're making now, both single whiskies and obviously the blended whiskies we'll make in the future, have got it right for that future period. Having said that, I did taste an absolutely. Having said that, Isabel, I did taste an absolutely remarkable Johnny Walker Red Label from about the 1930s when we did it. Well, you were there, I think. We did a sort of lineup tasting of Walker whiskies, and it was really great. But having said that, I always have a bottle of Black Label in my cupboard. These, you know, and enjoy it very much. In fact, I've got some in my glass just now, albeit in a highball.
So would that be the best Johnny Walker you've ever tasted?
No, I'm lucky enough to have tasted the different directors' blends that were produced some years ago, and then also the private collection, which was really a sort of rethinking and commercialization of the director's blend. And each of those releases sort of focused on one particular flavor, highlighted one particular flavor aspect of Walker's, although they were all blends. But there was one blend, for example, that was very heavily grain whiskey influenced. And then there was obviously a smoky one and a woody one and a fruity one. And some of those, I think, which contained, you know, a mixture actually of very young whiskies and very old whiskies. I mean, it was a real, you know, blenders' holiday to just go away and do what they wanted in this respect. I think some of those whiskies were probably the best Walkers I've tasted. And you sometimes have them at your auction, I notice.
Yeah, occasionally. You mentioned Laura Chilton earlier, but I was just wondering about the process of researching this, because you've been researching this for how long has it taken? And apart from a career in whiskey that spans 30 years, but when did you start actually researching for this book?
So it's taken 3 years and a few months from saying I was going to really start doing it to now.
And where's your source material for all of this?
So obviously Diageo has a huge, well, not huge, Diageo has the largest archive of historical material relating to alcohol beverage products in Scotland at Menstrie. And within that collection, the Johnny Walker collection of material is probably the largest. So that was my starting point. And in there, we had sort of formal records, minutes of the limited company, some early material, very little, but really precious early material that went right back to the start of the company, the correspondence of Alexander Walker that I think I mentioned, which is just astonishing. And then from the 1890s, a lot more material about overseas business, and yeah, a lot of stuff from there and then onwards. Also, actually, in the Diageo archives, one collection I spent a lot of time working on, which I hadn't expected to, was the W&A Gilbey collection. The Gilbey family had sort of self-styled themselves as the aristocracy of the drinks industry in the UK. And when the dispute broke out in the early 20th century between malt whiskey distillers and their stakeholders, if you will, and grain whiskey distillers and blenders around what could or couldn't be called whiskey, the Gilbeys were very prominent on the malt whiskey side. In fact, I think I described them as conspirators. And I tell you, that archive was great fun, because that was a real nutcase job business, really crazy. And then outside of our archive, there were other archives in Scotland that I consulted, but I suppose I probably spent most time in the British Library looking at both wine and spirits trade periodicals, not all of which have been used. I mean, people look at Harper's, but there were a couple that really had never been used before and were very informative. And then also a lot of work on advertising journals, which were burgeoning from the Edwardian period, and also popular culture journals as well, because I really tried to place Johnnie Walker and Scotch whisky in popular culture, particularly in the 1890s and in the early 20th century.
So, so my question, I have, it's a question. It's a slightly loaded question, I suppose. But I mean, how important is history to Johnnie Walker? And it tastes nice. Why is it important to cover the history of it?
Well, so I'll give you one example. I mean, you know, the past is always interesting. It's a sort of roadmap to where we are, and also can offer a roadmap to the future sometimes. But surprisingly enough, over the past 6 months, people started emailing me and talking to me and going, "Well, Nick, is there anything in the book about the Johnnie Walker brand going through hard times and coming out well on the other side?" Okay, so this theme of resilience, which is actually deeply in the soul of the brand, this Kilmarnock thrownness, is all about bloody resilience. You know, it's about not giving in. And of course, this is a brand that came through financial crises in various colonial markets in the 19th century, came through the turmoil of what is whiskey, which almost brought blended Scotch to an end at a stroke. It survived Lloyd George budget, which vastly increased the cost of Scotch whisky in 1909. Then came through First World War, an influenza epidemic, a Great Depression, and a Second World War. Now, just to give you a bit of idea of the scale of that, in around 1920, Walkers were selling 1 million 9-litre cases. By 1945, that stood at around 750,000. So that interwar period, although there were vast profits to be made in some markets, was very, very difficult for the brand, particularly actually in the UK market. But if you want to know about resilience and recovery, 1955, Johnnie Walker was selling 1 million cases. Okay, 1 million cases. 1975, it was selling 10 million. And in the early part of this century, it was selling over 20 million. That's a brand that's all about building up for the future, and resilience is built into its soul, you know?
Okay, so this isn't your first book, is it, Nick?
It's not, but
I have here.
Oh, good heavens.
So this is Lancashire Quakers and the establishment of 1660 to 1730. So with reference to the Lancashire Quakers and the establishment 1660 and 1730, what connects the two?
Curiosity. Curiosity. I think actually when I do history, one of the things I like to do is try and rescue people from the past, and also to try and perhaps challenge some deeply held orthodoxies. So although I'm not going to bore you about Quakers in the 18th century, my book was famous. As an author, you remember these things. My book was famously described in a review as path breaking, which is good enough for me. Okay. And I've tried to do a bit of path breaking with Walker and with the other things I'm interested in. I hate received belief, received wisdom, imagined histories. I just can't put up with that sort of stuff. So yeah, I'm like sword of truth.
And there's a lot of there's a lot of myth in the world of whiskey, I found.
There are.
There's a lot of stories that become true by the retelling of them, I suppose.
Well, and they become true because people desperately want to believe them as well. Desperately want to believe them. I don't know why. You know, all this golden age of whiskey stuff, for example. But I suppose it stops people from doing bad things, so it's harmless enough.
Here's my slightly off-topic question, but we're a whiskey auction, and we auction whiskey, spirits, books, memorabilia. I see a few things behind you there. The scenario I'm giving everyone here is the mob are after you. You need to pay them off quickly. What are you going to sell from your collection?
Hang on, look in the cupboard as well. Let's see. Well, I'll tell you what I'm not going to sell, which is a recent acquisition. This might surprise you a little bit. It's a ballet dancer.
That's a very classy choice there.
Very classy choice. Which my mum and dad had one of these, and it always came out at Christmas. And
is it working?
This one's working, yeah, but I'm not sure.
For those of you that are not familiar with the oh, you need to hold it a bit higher up, I think.
Yeah, I probably can't get it working here, so I haven't got a surface to put it on.
Never mind. Well, there we go.
That's classy, eh? Isn't that good?
That's quality. Perhaps
you never thought you'd see this at the whiskey show as a first.
Perhaps that's an idea for the next bottling of Johnny Walker. Okay, I've got a couple of questions beginning to come in here, so I might start opening it up to anyone else. As I say, keep your questions coming in. Anyone who wants to know about the Lancashire Quakers, that's sort of provincial cheesy breakfast, isn't it? Lancashire Quakers, or not? Okay, so let's start with, and James has got a couple of questions here, so I'm going to start with those. Nick, have you ever tasted Johnny Walker Old Highland? Do you know why it was losing money compared to the other blends? Was it more expensive whiskey in the makeup, or just not as popular?
Well, it's a bit. It's not about popularity. It's about the whiskey and the blends and the price it was being sold at. And the age, so it still had an age statement on it, and I think the price that it was at was unviable for the age of whiskey they were selling, and they didn't want to sort of reduce the quality of it, so they just got rid of it altogether and concentrated on red and black.
Another question from James here is, in the archive there's a Johnny Walker with a snake in it. What's the story?
Well, yeah, if you go north of Scotland, there are there used to be quite a few small local museums. I remember visiting one in Ullapool, or actually a couple around Ullapool many years ago, and you will always see bottles of whiskey with snakes in them in these places. And actually they were snakes that were captured or caught by schoolmasters, and they were put in bottles of whiskey to preserve them, and then they were used as exhibits in classrooms in tiny schools all over Scotland. We did have some can't remember what sort of snakes they were. We had some in a bottle at Talisker, which were actually found in one of the worm tubs. So they were just kept as sort of memorabilia, a bit weird, really. But normally speaking, those things have been done for educational purposes.
Excellent. Just before I go on to the next question, James, can you just confirm what time we've got? Have we got this until 7, or have we got it a little bit longer, just so that I don't suddenly get cut out halfway through a question? So while I'm waiting for that, Arturo's got a question for you. Dr. Morgan, can you talk a little about the conversations between Alexander Walker II and Miss Cummings?
Well, we don't know a lot about them, but Alex was a young man, and he'd come into the business and really stamped his authority on it in terms of both ramping up the acquisitions of whiskey and then also investing in primary production. And he was a whiskey obsessive, and he was asked in 1908 what he did for a living, and he said, well, all I've done for the past 25 years is look at whiskey samples. It was a bit of a lie, but I mean, he was making the point there. He was looking at Annan Distillery to buy, and then became aware that Cardew was for sale. And I think the circumstances of that was that Elizabeth Cumming was actually not well and wanted to secure her family's future. So they very readily acquired Cardew. And then Alexander went up there, and I guess with John Fleetwood Cumming, who was Mrs. Cummings, Elizabeth Cummings' son, then really more or less rebuilt the distillery. And I know there's somewhere in the archive, there are the compare books of the distillations when they sort of got it working properly. And I seem to recall seeing a comment in a margin from Alex Walker, which just says, "Spirit excellent!" ! Job done. Nice you're here, Arturo, by the way.
Okay, so there's a question here from Simon. Are any members or descendants of the Johnny Walker family still involved in any capacity, or if so, what sort of capacity are they involved in?
The last Walker to work in any formal capacity in the business was Alex, who became Sir Alexander Walker. He retired in 1940 and died about 10 years later, I think. There are members of the Walker family around, and we certainly engaged with the family of, well, it's a bit complicated, but I'll tell the story very quickly anyway. Alexander Walker, the first Alexander Walker's oldest son, John, or Jack as he was called, went out to Australia to manage their Australian export business, which is one of their biggest markets in the 1880s and 1890s. He married an Australian, had a child, and then became ill and died very young. And his son eventually came back to the UK, married. He died very young, but his son, who, by the way, was sitting on, I'll choose my language carefully, a shitload of Johnny Walker shares, was Rob Walker, who was a very, very famous racing driver, one of the greats of the 30s, 40s, and 50s in British motor racing, motorsport. And we borrowed one of his famous cars from his son, and his son was very helpful to us, coming out and talking about the family and stuff like that. But that was a very informal thing, and there's certainly none of them in the whiskey side of it at all.
Okay, I've got a question here from Serge. I'll answer first.
Bonsoir, Serge.
Okay, did you recently find more bottles of White Label?
No, did you? Have you been to Italy? Did you? Are there cases of it being made as we speak? No. I mean, we've got one or two, I think, in the archive, Serge. And as I say, I've seen them come at auction, both the online auctions like Isabel's, and also they've turned up at Bonham's every now and again. but they're very far and few between. And of course, the real, as I said earlier, the real sort of unicorns would be the pre-white red black label Old Highland, special Old Highland, extra special Old Highland. But I've never seen any of those. And of course, round bottles rather than square as well for novelty.
I can quite imagine those suddenly turning up at auction after this book. Okay, James says, can you explain the story behind Johnnie Walker's Swing? When were they first introduced and why? And so, was the bottle shape a marketing thing?
There it is. Swing was introduced, excuse me, I think in about 31 or 32. And it was simply an attempt to counter, in some markets that they had, a sort of consumer disaffection with red label. There was always a problem with black and red label. You know, this is going to sound obvious, but you know, it's a marketing problem. If you've got two products at different price points, everyone is going to assume that the more expensive one is the best one, which in some respects, obviously it is. But of course, the other products has got great integrity and qualities. You know, this is the same if it's washing powder or, you know, jam or whatever it might be. And sometimes that's fine, and people understand that one is one and one is the other. At other times, in certain markets, people get very disaffected with one and only want to buy the special one. And that was happening with red label in a couple of markets, and Swing was introduced to come in sort of slightly above red label and take up that gap in terms of consumer demand. And yes, the bottle was a marketing gimmick.
It's not to stay upright on a ship.
The bottle was a marketing gimmick.
Okay, Annabelle here I'm delighted to say that Charlie has reviewed the book very well for the next issue of the Keepers magazine, so watch this space. So we had Charlie here on Saturday, and he did mention, I think on Saturday when he was doing his book reading and afterwards, he'd read it and was just in some sort of awe having read it. Okay, so I've got a question about Alexander Walker. Now you mentioned you sort of, did you do you build up a relationship with a character that you're researching so much? How does that affect the whole process of the research?
Well, I think you do, and it was actually the same when I was doing my Quaker work, and I think to help develop an argument, a proper historical argument, it sometimes helps to polarize or over polarize people. So there are some people you have to like, and there are some people you really have to dislike, you know, and that helps you get through it. And certainly, whilst I mostly liked all of the Walkers, mostly, the one, as I said earlier, who I really fell for was Alexander, and he was just an absolutely remarkable person, absolutely remarkable. And to have had all that time to get inside his head and for him to get inside my head was quite a thing, and it'll be a long time before he gets out of it, I can tell you. And I suppose Sir James Stevenson, who I mentioned in one of the readings, who was really responsible for the introduction of the now famous, as we call him, striding man figure, also responsible for the first introduction of the first non-refillable bottle for Scotch whisky in 1913, went on to do war service and heaven knows what, was an intimate of Winston Churchill, died very young, unfortunately, because he still had sort of 15, 20 years of his career ahead of him. He was another person that I sort of was very much engaged with. And then there were others who, for legal reasons, I can't mention who I wasn't, you know. But it's just how you have to do that a bit, you know, to bring things to life, you know. And it was also no doubt that the Walkers didn't necessarily get on with everyone else in the whiskey business. and not everyone in the whiskey business got on with the Walkers. And you should remember the Walkers have been around for longer than most of them. So for people like the Dewars and Buchanans who'd come along, they actually thought that the Walkers were the old men of the business, which the third generation, who of course were actually all young men, took great resentment to. So a few sparks flew in those encounters.
Okay, here's one from Serge. I need to read this carefully because there's a bit of detail here. It says, I've got an Omega watch. A certain J.M. Walker was presented with in 1975 for his 25 years at Ainsley and Hebron. But I suppose he wasn't a Walker's descendant then? Question mark.
No. Did he leave his watch behind when he visited you once? So bring you over all that Klein leash for you.
He probably hasn't even yet noticed it's missing.
No, but seriously, Sir Alexander was the last one in the whiskey business, and the Walkers had always been in Walkers. They didn't go anywhere else. So a happy coincidence for Mr. Walker of Ainsley and Heilbronn.
A high number of Walkers in the whiskey trade, aren't we? We've got our own Walker in our auction too. So he says hi. So Serge found the watch at a watch auction, and it's engraved in the back. Okay, so I mean, the Lancashire Quakers, that was an sort of academic research project. This research project and book was for a brand that you work for. Did you ever find that there was any sort of conflict of interest? Was it never an issue, or was it constantly an issue? How did that affect the process?
No, I was really lucky to be left to get on with everything very much as I wanted to. I mean, obviously, when the manuscript was written, it had to be seen by corporates and our lawyers. Big business, that's inevitable. A few things were changed because of concerns over competition law and possibly almost defamation, I think. So
amongst friends here, what did you have to take out? What had to be changed?
Well, Isabel, if I told you what I had to take out, that would hardly make any sense.
Yes, but you're amongst friends.
Yeah, that's what they always say. That's what they always say.
We can be trusted with responsibility.
A few changes were made, but nothing that which I had always expected, but nothing which in any way altered the gist of the story, you know.
Any other questions from anyone here? Is there? Oh, yes, there is. So can you talk, this is from Simon, can you talk a little more about why the whiskey captured the public's imagination? To the point of essentially christening the brand themselves. Was it just down to quality? And he does say he does understand if we need to buy the book just to get the answer. But if you could give us an abridged answer then.
Well, I mean, it was at the time. So we're talking about the 1880s into the 1890s. And at the time, the leading brands would have been Walkers, Greenlees, Lawn Whiskey, Robertsons of Dundee, and then coming up very fast, of course, Dewars and Buchanans. But I think that leading space was quite important for Walkers. Also, it was a far more ambiguous brand in some respects than many of the others, because a lot of blenders very deliberately clothed their brands in Highland imagery. Henry Jeffries was talking about this when he spoke to Isabel on whenever it was, Isabel, sorry, I've forgotten.
On Monday, yeah.
On Monday. And the interesting thing about Johnny Walker is that from that white label bottle all the way through to the Striding Man figure introduced in 1908 and through to today, There's never been any tartan. It's not a tartan brand. It's always been a brand that's had much bigger aspirations, I think, than that. And I think maybe, Simon, that lack of men in kilts and all the rest of it just left room for people to imagine someone. And the public response that seemed to greet the figure that Tom Brown came up with suggests that they must have got it right. You know, this quite affable, slightly rakish, late Georgian, timeless sort of character. You know, just it was as if suddenly he appeared one day and everyone went, "That's Johnny Walker, just like I told you." You know, it's remarkable, quite remarkable. Oh, and the other thing I would say, because it's very often forgotten, is that we always think of when we think of Johnny Walker, we always tend to think of excuse me, Isabel, sorry.
It's fine.
We always tend to think of these print adverts, okay? Because that's what we have in the archive, and that's what you see in the books, right? And you see online as well if you search for Johnny Walker. But when this campaign was introduced in 1908, the principal medium for communication was the outdoor poster, the hand-painted and varnished, massive sort of 8-sheet posters all along tube routes and train routes and bus routes in London, in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, in Manchester, in Liverpool, in Birmingham, in Bristol, everywhere. And you have to imagine the impact that this advertising would have made, because what were people going to talk about when they got to the office the next day? They hadn't been watching Netflix or box sets at home or stuff like that. So these adverts were the currency of popular culture. That's why they sang about all this stuff in music hall as well, because music hall was just an echo chamber for what was going on around. And the first Walker poster, which sadly we only had a black and white reproduction from in a journal that was locked in the British Library during lockdown, so we couldn't get the illustration for the book, which was really really upsetting. But that first poster, hand-colored poster, is actually of the striding man figure walking out towards you and stepping out of the poster. I mean, it's a brilliant piece of graphic design, and that sort of stuff captures people's imagination at a stroke, you know.
Okay, James asks, okay, have you got any insight into the new Johnny Walker Visitor Centre coming soon in Edinburgh?
It's going to be astonishing. It's going to be astonishing. That's all I can say. I mean, the amount of thought and money that is going into it in that sort of flagship building. And I know I was listening to the Blenders talk this afternoon and earlier in the week when we were together about some of the work they're doing for the experiential side of it. So a lot of it is about whiskey knowledge and whiskey education. And I think it's going to be a real eye-turner, head-turner when it opens.
James wants to know.
Great shame it couldn't be open this year, of course. Really great shame.
Yeah, James wants to know if there'll be an Old Highland on the bar.
I doubt.
They need to do some more shopping at auction. Okay, if there's, I think we're coming to the end of the questions. I've got one final question for you, but I think that's it from everyone. Okay, so your book's been published now.
Published on the 29th of October.
29th of October. Yeah. Okay, and so what's the next project apart from traveling the world virtually, book signing virtually? Have you got another project? Is it going to be another research project on one of the Diageo brands? Will there be another, or are you going to switch to Famous Grouse? So
I talked earlier in one of the parts I read about this really entertaining guy called McGilligan, who worked for this company Marquis McGilligan, or McGilligan Marquis, and the Walker boys in London just nicknamed him the Marquis, and he was a very Macabre-ish figure, particularly when it came to Alexander Walker wanting to be paid, when his Macauberism went into overdrive. And I think I will just be Macauberish on this point, Isabel, and say that something will turn up, I'm sure, you know.
Superb. Thank you, Nick. That was amazing. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone who came along, and so many friends there, and thanks for sort of waving and saying hello. Just a reminder that if you missed anything or you came in late, we'll be uploading the recording of this book reading and the Q&A afterwards onto our exhibitor stand, hopefully by tomorrow. I think it does seem to take 24 hours or so, but do pop by and have a look. We'll also have the recordings of Charlie MacLean, Henry Jeffreys, and then tomorrow we've got I can hold this book because it does exist, Rachel McCormack's Chasing the Dram, and that's at 6 o'clock. And then at 3 o'clock every day we've got our sort of how-to guides that we're doing with my team, with James and Scott. But in the meantime, Nick, thank you so much for doing that for us. That was absolutely superb, and hopefully catch you soon.
Thanks, Isabel, and thank you everyone that stuck with me. It's really nice of you to come and listen. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.